So I thought we'll start with a kind of working definition of what bullshit is. It's taken from the work of a scholar named Frankfurt, and he identifies two distinctive characteristics of bullshit. So he says the first thing is that bullshit is articulated without a concern for the criteria of the truth. And the second thing is that when we engage in bullshit, the bullshitter willfully articulates bullshit in order to pursue their own purposes or interests. And in this sense, bullshit is somehow different to a lie in, the classic understanding of being a liar, in that when people lie, they set out with the clear intention to deceive people, to mislead people, to be dishonest. Whereas when we're bullshitting, it's not so much that we're trying to deceive people as more that we don't particularly care about the truth. There's a disregard for the truth. And we're using language in a way which helps to advance our own interests, which may be to make something that we're doing look good, or to cover over some kind of anxiety which we might have. So I think that's a useful working definition to keep in mind. Coming from that definition, I think it's useful for us to start to think about what might some of the varieties of bullshit be. If that's what bullshit is, what could it look like in the environments we find ourselves working? And I think there are many ways that we can talk about that. I think it's quite contextual. But I've drawn out here a sort of, this comes from actually from the work of an education scholar named Neil Postman, critical education scholar, and he wrote a really interesting speech, actually in the late 60s, and I think it's only become more and more relevant, called On Bullshit and the Art of Crap Detection. And in that speech, he created this taxonomy, this classification of bullshit. And I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's a good start. So he identifies these four major categories of bullshit. And I think it'd be useful to name those and to kind of feel our way into what some of those might be in our experience. So the first type of bullshit he talks about is pomposity. A word we'll encounter a little later is grandiosity, which is maybe similar, but kind of making things seem bigger, more important, pompous, more grand than they are, often in an attempt to kind of make ourselves look good. And so, I think that this is a very prevalent type of bullshit that we encounter in organizational life. Wherever we look, things are world-class, cutting edge. I don't know, Thomas, you had some great ones when we were talking earlier.
Right. Often you encounter phrases like quantum leaps, and these are applied randomly to anything you want to make sound special. So you can talk about quantum leadership or transformational leadership, and often the meaning is not quite clear.
Right, but it sounds very impressive. And I think there's something interesting there, because it's not to mean that transformation is not something real or something meaningful, but the way in which it's invoked can be with this kind of pompous intention. The second category that Postman draws attention to is what he calls fanaticism. And particularly, he draws attention to two types of fanaticism. So the first type he talks about is bigotry, which is, just good old-fashioned kind of bigotry, racism, sexism, whatever the case may be, where we use some kind of bullshit argument to perpetuate some sort of discrimination or hatred against difference. Stereotyping other people, these kinds of simplifications. But he also talks about something which is a little bit more subtle, which he calls Eichmannism. And he's drawing there on very famous trial that took place in the 1960s, the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem, which was written about by the Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, a very powerful Nazi bureaucrat. Eichmann had overseen the mass murder of hundreds of thousands of people. He was eventually arrested, put on trial in Jerusalem. And what she drew attention to is what she called the banality of evil, which is, I think, a term which is sometimes misunderstood. And I don't think she was meaning that the things which Eichmann had done were in any way banal. They were hideous, unimaginably so. But that this kind of process of bureaucratization, things had become so bureaucratic in his mind that he had become so distant from the lived experience of what he had actually done. And so he said things like, well, I was just doing my job. I was following orders. Famously said, some of my best friends are Jews. And so in a way, through this process of bureaucracy and sort of technocracy, the actual shocking value of what he was doing had become quite banal. So I think we see this kind of bullshit quite a lot. For instance, when there's a big oil spill, where companies are often, or some of the big data leaks and this type of thing, which have happened in recent times, where there's this kind of use of bullshit to kind of downplay responsibility and obfuscate in this way. The third type of bullshit which he draws attention to is what he calls inanity. So this is really just hot air. Lots and lots of words taking up a lot of space, not necessarily meaning terribly much. I think for people who've spent much time sitting in board meetings or reading board reports, I don't think it's a rule that it necessarily always has to be the case. But almost uniformly, when I find myself sitting in board meetings, there's an awful lot of inanity which happens, awful lot of hot air which is perpetuated, and a particular kind of language of bullshit which is used to do that. And then the fourth type of bullshit which he points to is what he calls superstition. And he uses this phrase, ignorance presented in the cloak of authority. So the way that we use language to, when we don't understand things, we feel ignorant about things or uncertain about things, we kind of come up with very official sounding or legitimate sounding language to cover over our ignorance. So Megan, you had a couple of examples there, didn't you?
Yeah, one of them that I was thinking about was when people pick up on, maybe someone in the organization has said, it's because we're a really siloed organization that the breakdown in communication has happened. And then all of a sudden you hear that in all of the talk in the organization where people are saying, it's because we're a siloed organization, or yes, we're a really siloed organization. And all of a sudden that becomes the kind of blanket for all of the problems that exist within the organization. That's definitely something that I've seen.
And again, interesting in that that's not to say that organizational silos necessarily don't exist, or that might not be a useful thing to draw attention to sometimes. But that language can be used to kind of cover over a sense of just not knowing, in a way which carries this almost kind of mythical, superstitious kind of power.
And another one might be if it's a family business and people then say, oh, it's just because of the family dynamics in the business. And it becomes this all about the family dynamics in the business and nothing to do with anybody else.
It takes on a kind of mythical kind of proportion.
Yeah.
I think those are good examples. Thank you. Good. So that's a little bit about perhaps what some ways of understanding what bullshit might be. But I think, it begs a question, if bullshit is prevalent, if it's pernicious, if it's harmful, if it's irritating, then why do we seem to spend so much time doing it? And I think that these are really good questions for us to be asking ourselves. how might bullshit be simultaneously enabling and constraining? So how might it enable us to do certain things while limiting us from doing other things? So certainly when we engage in a lot of bullshit, it limits our access to the truth. It obscures the truth. But what useful things might it do? What functions might it be serving? So I've turned to a couple of critical management scholars who've written broadly around this topic, because I think they give us some interesting insight. So the first person who I thought was quite interesting, has some interesting things to say about this, is the Swedish critical management scholar Mats Oliverson, and he's writing here together with Gabriel about grandiosity, which is, maybe close to pomposity. And he says, grandiosity is linked to the widespread narcissism of our times and a generalized craving to enhance self-esteem. The desire to be fascinating assumes both personal and collective expressions. Organizations, institutions, and groups assume labels: cutting edge, world-leading, internationally famous, seeking to boost their claims to sophistication and status, much in the same way that individuals do. The appeal of grandiosity and the social pressures to enact it create significant obstacles for management learning. Topics and methods signaling something glamorous and narcissistically satisfying attain great currency, uncritically seducing students into naive acceptance of superficial and dubious knowledge. So I think there are two really kind of key points that Oliverson's making here. And I think the first one is that I think there's a connection between bullshit, grandiosity, and narcissism, and our need to feel esteemed, to feel good about ourselves, to look good in front of other people. And part of the reason that we might use a lot of bullshit is to make ourselves look better than we might secretly believe that we really are. But I think the second point that he's making here is that actually this can make really learning about what's going on in organizations and learning about leadership quite difficult. Because a lot of the things which are conversations which are really important, which we really might need to have, might not be that sexy or that glamorous. They might not feed those kinds of narcissistic needs. So who wants to talk about management when they could be talking about leadership? And who wants to talk about leadership when they could be talking about transformative leadership? But the reality is that there still are, the quite granular kinds of challenges of what it means for people to do things together, which we need to contend with. And, those might be more difficult to talk about in this kind of grandiose way. And so we might be seduced into directions which are less helpful. Similar kind of point made here by Andre Spicer, who's a professor at Cass Business School in London. And he talks about the way that bullshit allows individuals to build up an appealing image. And he writes here particularly about the way that consultants use bullshit to impress clients. There we go. To impress clients. And I think it's quite a humorous kind of anecdote here, because he talks about how when consultants meet each other, how they often find themselves dropping that bullshit because there's a kind of mutual recognition that it's not really representative of reality. And I would say to a degree, sometimes organizations are quite self-aware. Leaders in organizations are quite aware that the kind of bullshit which is being sold is not necessarily corresponding to reality. And yet, there's a kind of game which is being played in terms of trying to find the most impressive articulation. So there's a kind of rhetorical game which is going on at the same time. But he goes on to talk about the way that we don't do that only to impress other people, but that bullshit might also play a really important role in helping us to impress and convince ourselves. In a world where there's a lot of research pointing to the idea that more and more people are finding their jobs meaningless. There's an increasing there was a book that came out last year by David Graeber from LSE, where he writes about his bullshit jobs hypothesis, pointing to the large amount of people in post-industrial societies who fundamentally doubt the usefulness of what they're doing every day at work. And yet there's an enormous amount of effort placed in organizations on helping people to make their jobs meaningful, make them feel fun. So there might be a role that bullshit plays in helping us to convince ourselves that what we're doing is really worthwhile. And I think that's in the same vein, perhaps to cover over the anxiety that we feel at not knowing.
And can I add something, Matt, there? I think a danger there is when there's so much focus at the moment on positive engagement. And a real danger there is that you then create this feeling within organizations in terms of what you're allowed to talk about, which is it's great to be positively engaged. And you tell us all these examples when you're positively engaged. But then when someone doesn't feel positively engaged and they've got this sense that what they're doing doesn't mean anything, they're not actually given the space to talk about it. And so it gets suppressed. And so it's this kind of unwritten, kind of hidden transcript hidden underneath what's happening in the organization, and it's not really being talked about because it's all about we've got to have every single employee positively engaged all the time. And the reality is that's just not how life is.
Yeah. Andreas Spice actually wrote a book a number of years ago called The Wellness Syndrome, where he writes about exactly this, the emphasis on wellness and happiness in organizations can actually be quite sick. In that sometimes people might find their jobs boring and meaningless because their jobs are boring and meaningless. And finding your job boring and meaningless when it's boring and meaningless is actually a pretty healthy thing. Good. So I don't want to, I've already said quite a lot. I'd like to just add a few thoughts on, well, what can we do if we consider all of this bullshit? And so the first thing that I would like to suggest, and this is returning once again to Postman's art of crap detecting, he puts down, I think, a good sort of rule of thumb. He says, at any given time, the chief source of bullshit with which you have to contend is yourself. And I think that's a good place to start. If we're wanting to think carefully about what we want to do in the face of bullshit, a good place to start is by maybe considering the role that we play in creating and perpetuating and participating in bullshit on a daily basis. Perhaps we do that more than we think we do because it might be difficult for us to spot. So, building our kind of reflexive capability to think about, how might we be participating and perpetuating bullshit, and why might we be choosing to do that? Recognizing that it might serve a legitimate function. It's not in and of itself necessarily a bad thing. And remain curious, remain humble and open. Postman writes, almost nothing is about what you think it's about, including yourself. And then he goes on to say, every day, in almost every way, people are exposed to more bullshit than is healthy for them to endure. And if we can help them to recognize this fact, they might turn away from it and towards language that might do them some earthly good. So I think once we start to notice our own bullshit and take our own bullshit more seriously, we can, with humility and kindness and with openness to the very legitimate functions that bullshit might serve, start to engage people around us in conversations around, what is it that we're actually doing together? And that might open up some some new possibilities in how we think about the work that we're doing and how we talk to each other. So I'm going to pause there because I think I've said probably enough words. And I would like us to take the opportunity in just a minute to start exploring some of these ideas together with each other. So we're going to be broken up into small groups. And I would like you to talk about two things, trusting that I'm not going to be doing any kind of detailed surveillance. So I guess you could talk about whatever you want to talk about. But I think it would be interesting to delve a little bit into what bullshit have you been participating in at work? So if you think about your professional, even your personal, but your professional experience, where have you encountered and experienced bullshit and how have you been involved in it? And start to feel your way into some of those examples and how you became aware of it. I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. And then also, are there some ideas that I've put on the table today which are maybe shaping the way that you're starting to think about bullshit? So I think that's the direction I'd like to point you in. I thought maybe it's useful to hear one or two examples. So I don't know, Megan or Thomas, if either of you would like to give an example of where you've encountered bullshit in your practice, might give a sense of what we're talking about.
Go ahead, Thomas.
Well, what I found really dangerous is that often bullshit starts with very good intentions. And I have in mind this situation where you have some kind of aspirational goal in an organization, and you want to be people at their best. So we develop a language where we are talking about ourselves as best and doing things well. And when we are starting that, we kind of remember it is aspiration, and that we are doing that to boost our own self-confidence and to help others to have some motivation to get there. But over time, we kind of forget how it started, and we start believing our own bullshit. And when it happens, it's too late to say, well, come on, I am not the best, because then everybody talks about him or her as doing the best work, being the most in what not. And you come in and you feel like saying, hey, I'm not very good at that, but then you don't have courage to do that. So that's how I understood that I am participating in bullshit by fearing to be honest about my own abilities in a community that was aspiring to be best, but mostly talking about it and not being able to critically engage in who they are and how they are.
Great, thank you. Megan.
Yeah, the one I was going to talk about was when we were working with a client, and it was quite new in terms of what we were doing. So there was definitely a sense of we need to prove to ourselves that what we're doing has some form of impact on people. And so there was definitely an anxiety around the way in which we were seeing our work. And there was also this kind of need to buy into the language that the organization was talking about in terms of what their aspirations for this type of partnership might look like. And I remember right at the beginning, this was years ago now, people were going through this leadership development program that we were running. And then all of a sudden there became this language that was, have you been risified yet? And it was really odd. And it was nothing that we came up with, but we then kind of bought into it in the sense of, it started to create this like weird separation between the leaders of the organization that had been through this this leadership program that, you know, suddenly risified them, which is just awful. And then everybody else that hadn't been through the program felt like they'd missed out on some type of opportunity and that they weren't worthy of being risified. And actually the purpose of our work and the intention of our work was to try and get people to work better together and to create collaboration across silos and across departments and functions and hierarchy. And actually what we ended up doing in the beginning was creating separation in a completely unintended way. And the language that was then kind of used in the organization was actually quite dangerous. And it took us a while to try and like pull that back, to kind of stop that language. And that was just a real key example of when I felt I was part of creating that dynamic within that organization.
Right, fanaticism. So I think it's something interesting there about bullshit and ideology. And
yeah, it was really weird.
I'm just seeing some of the comments. You know, I see Peter said something there about how much of the actual GNP of a country might depend on the bullshit in the business sector. And I think that this is the world that we live in, and that bullshit is prevalent and functional. So, you know, being judgmental about it is not particularly helpful. Inquiring into it is helpful. In fact, because bullshit plays an important role in power. You know, below that, people are talking about the race going on in the UK at the moment, but you know, other countries which will remain nameless, there are you know, very powerful world leaders who have rise to some of the most senior positions on campaigns which have been based almost entirely on bullshit, but you know, have evidently been successful. So, you know, I think there's a lot to contend with there. Okay, so let's move on. So, Megan, do you want to send us away? Okay, so I guess what I would love is to just hear from people what interesting things came out of your conversation. You know, what's stimulated for people right now.
So raise your hand and I will pick somebody. James, you're on mute. There we go. Yep.
Got you. So we spoke interestingly about a strategy to combat bullshit is just having the confidence to ask people the question, to articulate what they're trying to say. So our example was when buzzwords get generated, in a proper way, call someone out. And what do you mean by that? Because if you can't articulate and explain it to me, I can't really use that buzzword and without every good intention not turn it into bullshit, because I don't really understand what you're saying. And if that message gets lost within the whole organization, then with all the good intentions of not producing bullshit, you then just are producing, you know, copious amounts of bullshit.
Thanks, Jane.
So, I mean, I think there's something interesting there on, you know, the strategies for calling bullshit. You know, and I think there are occasions in which naming it, that's bullshit, could be useful. There are moments in which unpacking it in the way you're describing, James, in terms of, okay, well, let's see if you can articulate that in a different way so that we can reach some shared understanding about what it could mean. But I think part of the challenge of bullshit, A, is its invisibility, but B is that I think it's often covering over something which is quite dangerous or quite painful. And so there's a sense in which that strategy in some circumstances, I think, could have unintended consequences. I don't know whether they'll be useful or not. It could be.
Gita, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just building what James was saying, which was, why is it that we might call it out sometimes, and why might we and other times it just feels inappropriate or dangerous? I think because, and as a consultant, I've just felt either that I might expose somebody, and so we kind of finished our breakout room with this idea of no one wants to touch the bullshit, because it stinks, basically. And yet kind of what it kind of connected to what Matthew just said as well, that it feels dangerous to go there, because you might be, you know, speaking to power to say, what is it we actually mean? Or unearthing something that's so difficult to get our heads around. Yeah, what is it we're actually talking about when we're talking about this vision, kind of this holy grail? So, yeah, and we haven't really touched on power at all and how that links to bullshit. So I thought that was interesting.
Raise your hands. Justin. And then we'll go to Nana. Justin first.
Okay, so I've unmuted myself. I have read a book this year called The Fearless Organization by Professor Amy Edmondson. And we were chatting, because I think, Chris, you've used her talk about psychological safety in your work. Psychological safety is the feeling that you've got the benefit of the doubt to raise ideas, but also concerns. And to summarize it, you don't need a whistleblowing function in an organization when there is a psychologically safe workplace. So research this year has suggested that mortality in the NHS has dropped because people feel able to speak up with concerns. But my sense, I guess one of the things that came to mind as we were maybe finishing off on our session was the emperor's new clothes. So there's this shared delusion. So no one wants to speak up and say the emperor's not wearing any clothes. So it takes a child and that innocence of a child to actually pierce the bubble. So maybe the sort of final thing to finish on is that Professor Amy's work suggests sort of 3 steps, which I won't go into, but 3 steps in terms of creating an environment of psychological safety where people feel that they can speak up. And I think bullshit is a function of an organization which is not psychologically safe, and it's not that people, if you like, are forced to perform, but they can't take risks because they're not allowed to fail.
Thanks, Justin. Let's go to Nana next.
Actually, it's funny that Justin spoke just then, because I'd been reading the chat and what Justin had put there about psychological safety. And in our little group, that was one of the terms that I'm a psychologist by training. And that was one of the terms that I put out there, as suddenly I'm hearing it everywhere. And it's what it's become a bullshit. And it's not, there's nothing, you know, has been around for donkey's years, and I now feel that, as well as some other, you know, words. But it's funny, I was just going to comment on that. And then you talked about it, and yeah, because they are not feeling psychological safe, and it relates to things around feedback and all of that kind of stuff. But that very word has also now become bullshit, in my view and my experience across organizations. So a bit like unconscious bias, which is another one that I put in our little group. So so that's the comment I was going to make.
I think that's a really fantastic point, Nana, because I think you know, so I think that this is part of what's so confounding, is that you know, it's easy to in a way it's easy to spot bullshit where it's, you know, just so obviously unhelpful or untrue. But a lot of things which sort of develop into bullshit, or potentially could be used in a bullshitty way, are things which are in essence very true and very useful. You know, so there's something immensely useful in the idea of psychological safety, and it's very relevant, as Justin's pointing, to the conversation about bullshit and how we build our capacity to speak up about bullshit. And at the same time, it can play a role in perpetuating bullshit and become a type of bullshit itself. You know, and be used to discipline people. Oh, you know, you can't speak like that because, you know, you're not providing psychological safety, or, you know, whatever the case may be. And that becomes very complex and quite difficult to have a conversation about, because, you know, when we're using these kinds of words, they can mean very different things to different people in their particularization.
I saw two other hands. Let's do Simon and then Carolina. Just unmute yourself.
Hello, everybody. I think, it's true that if I'm meeting a new client or a prospective, I in that process of building a relationship, I am colluding with some of their bullshit. And I think there's inevitability to that. I can't sort of, go full frontal on every aspect of their conversation or stuff that I think might be drivel. But then, of course, if you're not careful, you then also lose your flexibility to call the bullshit. So there's something in that dance of building relationship and sort of at some juncture saying, I'm not really quite sure I see that way. What do you really mean by that? But there's a dance that takes place there. You can't, I don't think we'd have any clients if we didn't have some capacity to absorb a certain proportion of bullshit in getting to know each other to figure out whether we can actually do something useful together. By the way, Clive, I wasn't meaning you on this conversation.
Thanks. Carolina, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks. I like the psychological safety being bullshit remark as well, because we had a similar stuff in our group and we talked, what isn't bullshit? Is opposite of bullshit, radical authenticity. And, I said also, being authentic, it's also a buzzword now, and it could also become real bullshitty terms. So what I really liked though was, what isn't bullshit? When am I not bullshitting? And that's how we got to, there was sort of one of the things was, the opposite of bullshit is psychological safety. But it still kept me going, what isn't bullshit? And to really think about that. When I am, and I think it was Brigitte who said, it's when I am explaining, when I'm taking all the layers of all of what I want to say, making it really clear, really simple, and getting the message across without any of the nice fancy stuff to make it look better, more clever, or at least that's how I understood it. So what isn't bullshit? The question stayed with me.
Thanks, Carolina. Probably got time for one more comment. Oh, silence. Okay, Matthew, over to you.
Exciting. Well, yeah, I think that's an interesting point, Carolina, that you're bringing up, and maybe an interesting place for us to kind of draw the conversation to a close for now. Is I think it's very easy for us to try and create a very black and white dichotomy of bullshit, not bullshit. Like, this is when we're speaking not bullshit, this is when we're speaking bullshit, and then we can work out when we're doing bullshit, when we're not doing bullshit. Whereas I don't think that it's that simple most of the time. So I think it's a really good question. When am I not engaged in bullshit? To an extent, we might always be engaged in some degree of bullshit, and we might also be engaged in some degree of not bullshit. So, I think it's much more of a complex kind of continuum, which is about a social process that we're engaged in with other people. We're not coming up with bullshit all by ourselves. It's something which we're creating in a conversation with other people. And it's not something which we will just cure and make disappear. So I think the invitation here is for us to keep this conversation going with each other as we're able. Here at Rise Beyond, we're really interested in engaging in an ongoing conversation with anyone who wants to play. But also, with our colleagues, with our clients, how can we pay more attention, pay a better quality of attention to our experience and taking that seriously together?